Well, over the last 3 weeks, we've walked through Matthew chapter 18, examining what life in Christian community often looks like. Every Christian community, whether that's a group of Christian friends, or it's your grace group or your grow group, or it's an entire local church, every Christian community is going to be impacted by sin in some way. We're all sinners. We're saved by grace. Nevertheless, sin persists at times, and that sin will impact the relationships we have. So every Christian community, we saw in Matthew 18, has the need to practice radical forgiveness and be eager for reconciliation. That's what Jesus teaches us there. Well, as we step into Matthew 19 this morning, Matthew has, by God's inspiration, grouped these teachings and these scenes in a really strategic way, because in Matthew 19, it's a different scene, it's a different group of people, it's a different context. Nevertheless, it still has to do with sin in interpersonal relationships and the damage sin causes in those relationships. This time, though, in the most intimate of all relationships, and that is in marriage. And so what I want us to do is I want us to go ahead and read Matthew 19. Our text is verses 1 through 12. We want to read it in its entirety, and then we're going to make a few comments and then walk back through it a little bit more slowly, okay? Matthew 19, 1 through 12. Matthew says, "Now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, 'Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?' He answered, 'Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? So they're no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate.' And they said to him, 'Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?' He said to them, 'Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. Then I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery.' The disciples said to him, 'If such is the case of a man with his wife, it's better not to marry.' But he said to them, 'Not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it's given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this, receive it.'" So now I know that the topic of divorce is a difficult subject. It's a subject that's bound to elicit lots of emotions. Probably most, if not all of us here have been impacted by divorce in some way or another. Some here perhaps are recently divorced. Some this morning perhaps feel like the marriage that they're in is headed down that path today. And so I know the weight of this topic. Nevertheless, we want to hear the words of Jesus, and we want to submit our lives to his word. And so this is actually not the first time that Jesus teaches on marriage and divorce in Matthew's gospel. Because if you remember back earlier in the series, in the Sermon on the Mount, you remember chapters 5, 6, and 7, there Jesus actually gives a few verses on divorce in chapter 5. And so in this walk through Matthew's gospel, we've already actually touched on this topic. In fact, I don't really intend to duplicate that this morning. I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that sermon. Again, that was Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 and 32. The date of that was January 24th of 2024, so a little over a year ago. I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that. Kevin did a great job of talking through what the Bible says about divorce in that sermon. What I want to do from this passage, though, this morning is we're going to look at what's going on specifically in this interaction between the Pharisees and Jesus surrounding this topic. Because I think what it does is it gives us this opportunity really to strengthen our biblical view of marriage in the midst of cultural confusion and chaos that just surrounds us every day regarding marriage. And ultimately, it points us to the hope of the gospel. And so that's where we're going with this morning. Matthew 19, let's go ahead and start again. Verse 1. Now, when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee, entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" Okay, so again, here's Pharisees. These are Jewish religious leaders, the teachers of the day. They come to Jesus looking to challenge him, and they challenge him by asking him a question about marriage and divorce. And again, their question is pretty simple, pretty easy to understand. They just ask, Jesus, can a husband divorce his wife for any reason? Now, what's important to understand behind that question is it was not just a question that the Pharisees came up with to kind of pit themselves against Jesus. This was a question that the Pharisees often debated among themselves because they didn't have full agreement on this either. In fact, really, there were two main schools of thought within the Pharisees about divorce. Each one of those groups led by an influential rabbi. One was a more conservative view of divorce. The other group, a much more liberal view of divorce. And depending on your interpretation of an application of a portion of the law, specifically in Deuteronomy chapter 24, you would find yourself in one of these two groups. Because there in Deuteronomy 24, I won't read it this morning, but regulations are given about divorce within the nation of Israel and about remarriage after divorce. But there's a phrase that's used there that describes divorce based on some indecency of the wife, or divorce based on anything indecent, depending on your translation. And the group's view of divorce really depended which of those words they gave focus to. Okay, so for example, one group of Pharisees, the more conservative end of the spectrum, they gave way more attention to the word indecent or indecency there. In other words, they believed that the law limited divorce to sexual immorality. That in their view, divorce should be limited to only very serious cases, such as the case of adultery. Well, the other group of Pharisees, the more liberal group, they gave more attention to the word anything. In that phrase, anything indecent. And so they believed and they taught that divorce was permissible really on the basis of pretty much any reason they could come up with. And this liberal view of divorce was the dominant view of Jesus' day. This was the common view. In fact, the Mishnah, if you've ever heard of that, the Mishnah was the collection of oral traditions from rabbis as they applied the law to daily life. The Mishnah listed lots of reasons that a man could divorce his wife. So for example, the Mishnah, again, this is not the Bible, this is the Mishnah, permitted divorce if a wife had certain physical flaws that made her unattractive to her husband. Like things like poor posture, thinning hair, missing teeth. I'm not making those up. Those are actually listed in the Mishnah, okay? Again, according to the Mishnah, a man could divorce his wife if she didn't meet her husband's needs at home, whether that's sexually or practically. He could divorce her if she overcooked a meal. It's listed. Or he could divorce her if he just simply found someone else he thought was prettier than her. I mean, again, the Pharisees were divided over the proper grounds for divorce. And so they come to Jesus, they want to test him, and they ask him, do you agree with the common belief of the day that a husband can get a divorce for almost any reason? Now, it's worth pointing out here, really, not much has changed, has it? Because in reality, even though, it isn't based on one's reading of Deuteronomy 24, but again, the common view in culture today is that divorce really is permissible for pretty much any reason, isn't it? The establishment of no-fault divorce is an example of this idea. That one can simply say, you know what, this person is not who I thought they were, or this person has changed, or I've changed, or I no longer have those same feelings for this person anymore. We've just kind of fallen out of love with one another. And then they pursue divorce. While most people in our culture support their decision, saying, you know what, that's an understandable course of action. So again, not based on Deuteronomy 24, but yet the idea still persists. And so the Pharisees asked Jesus, so what do you think? But Jesus does something they probably weren't expecting. In fact, Jesus does this a lot with the Pharisees, doesn't he? He responds in a way that they don't expect. Because instead of going to the Deuteronomy 24 passage, the passage at the center of the debate, what does Jesus do? He goes much further back. In fact, he goes to creation. So he's not even talking about Deuteronomy. He goes to creation. Look again at verses 4-6. Jesus answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God's joined together, let not man separate." Again, Jesus doesn't even address the Deuteronomy passage. I mean, there's a place for that. There's a place for explaining and talking through what the law says there. But Jesus is trying to make a different point for the Pharisees here. Jesus' answer is refocusing the topic, reshaping the conversation. And his answer is that the foundation for understanding marriage is found not in the law, but actually in creation. And this reminds us that the Bible isn't merely a collection of random religious facts or a collection of religious teachings or sayings. The Bible tells a story. It tells the story of everything. It tells the story of the world that you and I live in. And the story begins, not in the year that you were born. The story does not begin in our generations, whenever that was. Rather, the story begins at creation. It begins when the eternal God spoke everything into existence out of nothing. It begins when God creates the world, and creates the animals, and he creates mankind, places them in the garden. He looks around and he calls everything very good. And so creation is what informs us of God's design. God's design for the world and God's design for our relationships. That's where we go, and that's what Jesus wanted to remind them. We're not talking about the law here. We're talking about what God created in the garden. And so here Jesus quotes from Genesis 1, verse 27, and Genesis 2:24. He's quoting there from the creation account, again, to highlight these truths about marriage that are so important in this discussion of divorce. And what Jesus does is he reminds them that God's design for marriage at creation is that it is a lifelong, intimate union between a man and a woman. Now, obviously, that understanding has been completely rejected by many in our culture. However, we have to remember that marriage was God's idea, not man's idea. It was his creation. And inherent in creation is a design. And so to reject this design really is to reject the designer. It's to say, God, what you've made isn't really very good as you think it is. And so it should shift, it should change. But again, marriage is designed, Jesus reminds them, to be a lifelong intimate union between a man and a woman. In fact, the biblical language that helps us kind of understand this idea is the word covenant. Right? It's a promise of not just present love, but also of future love. Right? We've all been to weddings when a man and a woman takes vows. I mean, it's just such a special moment, isn't it? But the best vows speak to far more than just how that other person makes them feel in the moment. Right? Like the best vows, much like the traditional vows in a ceremony, are when a groom and a bride, they look into each other's eyes and they vow to love the other person no matter what comes in the future. It's a covenant they make together before God. And God creates a union described as one flesh. Now, the problem is so often we treat marriage very differently than that of a covenant, isn't it? Most of the time, marriage is viewed and treated like a contract. Now, a covenant and contract are two very different things, aren't they? Contracts are dependent on both parties upholding their end of the agreement. Right? Like, for example, I have a contract with AT&T to provide my cell phone service. We have a contract, right? And we have an agreement. I pay my monthly bill, and that means AT&T provides me with service. However, if either end of this agreement drops the ball, you know what happens? The other end of this agreement, the other party, isn't obligated to their agreement. Right? Like if I don't pay, they're not going to provide me service, and I don't expect them to. And vice versa. If they don't provide me service, I'm not going to want to pay, right? Because the contract's broken. And so often marriages are treated that way, isn't it? Like as long as my spouse provides or proves useful and beneficial to me, then I'll continue to stay committed to this relationship. But if he or she drops the ball in any area, then I'll consider this isn't what I signed up for. I might leave. But again, that's not what a covenant says. A covenant is a promise of future love. And by the way, love not as like in that warm, fuzzy feelings that we all have when we're dating and we're engaged. I mean, love as in a commitment. Commitment to say that no matter what, I'm here. Like no matter what, I'm not going anywhere. I've covenanted myself to you. Now listen, if you've been divorced, I want to be careful that you don't feel like this sense of, or a false sense of guilt. Because as we know, there are times that divorce is a real option. And in the worst cases, we might even say necessary. And Jesus knows this too. In fact, he goes on to address this, going on in verse 7 through 9. And so they said to him, so the Pharisees reply to Jesus, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce to send her away?" He said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." So here's the Pharisees, and they ask Jesus, all right, if we're talking about creation, and that's really the design for marriage. Again, if marriage is meant to be a lifelong union, then how come Moses commanded divorce? Like notice they use that word there, command. Jesus answers and says, no, hold on, that's not what Moses said. No, Moses allowed divorce. That's a big difference. He allowed divorce. Divorce has been allowed because of sin. And this is really important for us to understand, especially in our culture. Sin is what damages marriage, not God's good design. In other words, it's not like God messed up with his design and like that wasn't really a good idea, Lord. Therefore, we should change it or ignore it. No, it's always our sin and our pride and our selfishness that corrupts what God calls very good. Again, we hear all kinds of complaints from culture about what might be dubbed traditional marriage, right? Like it's not uncommon to hear people say that this biblical view of marriage is outdated, that this view of marriage is based on a particular culture with its own set of values. Because culture has changed, therefore marriage should change along with it. Or some say that, biblical marriage is inherently patriarchal and thus inherently oppressive. Or they may say that the biblical lifelong goal of marriage to the same person is incredibly limiting to one's freedom. So people speak of their spouse as, the ball and chain, or marriage as the death sentence, right? That marks the end of any enjoyment you can have in life. But again, it isn't God's good design for marriage that's harmful. It's the sin of husbands and wives that are harmful, right? But God knows that. This is not new to him. This isn't a surprise to him. And so no, he hasn't placed this impossible burden on his people with something that was actually designed for human thriving and flourishment. Again, God acknowledges the existence of sin in a marriage and all of the destruction that it can cause. And so Jesus does come in and he says, listen, Moses didn't command divorce, but it is allowed due to sin. And Jesus says specifically here, divorce is permissible when sexual immorality is involved. Okay, now, the word there in the Greek for sexual immorality is the Greek word porneia. It's a word that has a very broad meaning. Jesus has in mind here then much more than just adultery, even though adultery certainly would be a form of sexual immorality. We know that because there's actually a different Greek word specifically for adultery that we actually read elsewhere, even in Matthew's gospel. So if Jesus wanted to limit divorce to adultery, he could have used that word, but he didn't. He used this general term for sexual immorality. In fact, later in the New Testament, in 1 Corinthians 7, the Apostle Paul, again, inspired by God in his writings, builds on Jesus' teaching and also mentions that divorce is permissible when a spouse is deserted by the other person. Now, in 20 years of full-time ministry, walking with couples who are going through tremendous difficulties, I've learned that honestly, most cases are just not as black and white as we might think. Now, there are the occasional clear cases of one spouse just breaking the marriage covenant in obvious ways. However, there are just so many occasions when, as a pastor, it can be really tricky to know how to apply a biblical understanding for divorce and remarriage. That's why there are many good pastors and good biblical scholars who disagree over how to properly apply some of these passages. Again, it takes a ton of wisdom. But understand what we do know, the overall biblical principle should be that, divorce is permissible at times, but rarely preferable. Now, with that, even though God's design and desire that marriages be lifelong commitments, because of the devastation of sin in our lives, divorce is sometimes preferable. Right? We think of situations like abuse, right, where the spouse should leave. And even include the police. Like we would chalk up abuse to an issue of desertion, a spouse who isn't pleased to live with their spouse, as Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 7. But again, there's so much to say about all of that, but we should see the beauty of marriage, the good that is marriage, which means we should see divorce as a last option rather than a first choice. Now, we've quoted Tim Keller's analogy before, but I'll share it again because it's so helpful. It's that divorce is not like changing the clothes we wear. It's like an amputation. Now, if you think about that, there are times when an amputation is necessary. But an amputation is never desired. It's definitely not the first option we want to go to. We do anything to save our limbs. And the marriages that we've entered into by covenant should be valued the same way. But God acknowledges, no, we do too, that sometimes the marriage covenant has been broken beyond repair. But at the same time, let me say, let's not be too quick to make that pronouncement on our marriages. God really does redeem hopeless situations. God really does change hearts. God really does heal broken relationships. We have seen this happen time and time again. We have an incredible care ministry. They do incredibly good work. Marriages on the brink of divorce and coming together and being healed. We've seen divorced couples actually being reunited and returning to one another after their divorce. And so hear me say, we don't want to belittle the real pain and real devastation that sin can cause in marriage, but we want to put our hope in the one who really can redeem them. So believe that he can. Pray that he will. And if that's you and you're in that boat, get help to do the tough work of reconciliation. God really does heal. God really does redeem. But going on in Matthew 19, look at verse 10 through 12. The disciples, Jesus' disciples said to him, well, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it's better not to marry. But he said to them, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it's given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men. And there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who's able to receive this receive it. Like, catch that. Even Jesus' own disciples are kind of shocked by his take. They say, well, man, if that's the case, it's better not get married. Like, I kind of imagine the boys chuckling a little bit there, grinning at each other when they say that. But like, consider the response there for a second. Like, they're willing to disobey Genesis 1, to be fruitful and multiply, in order to safeguard themselves from, at times, difficulties in marriage. And again, this is incredibly common in culture today. Again, often we hear people say, I'd rather not get married because I'm not ready to settle down. Or because I want to preserve my freedom, or I want to pursue my career because I want to focus on some other personal goal. They say, like the disciples in the same vein, it's just better to not get married. But notice Jesus' response. He actually acknowledges their response. However, what he does is he corrects their motivation for that. In fact, he uses eunuchs as an analogy. If you don't know what that is, generally a eunuch was someone who didn't experience normal sexual development, which meant they were incapable of or lacked a normal desire for sexual relationships. And Jesus says, some are natural eunuchs. In other words, they're eunuchs due to some kind of birth defect. He said some were made eunuchs by man. This is by way of castration. Those eunuchs in those days were oftentimes servants in the royal court because they lacked sexual desire. They were trusted to not pursue sexual relationships with the king's harem. But here Jesus says, yes, those things are true, but even some Christians, he says, have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. Now, to be clear, he is not saying that some Christians have literally and physically made themselves eunuchs. But what he's saying is that they have chosen a life of celibacy. But he says, notice, it's for the sake of the kingdom of heaven that they've done that. In other words, it's a way, according to Jesus and Paul later, that one might give more attention to serving the Lord and others without all the added responsibilities of caring for a family. And so that's where Jesus is correcting the disciples' attitudes. Because they're saying, okay, well, man, it's just hard. That sounds like a really long commitment. Maybe it's better that I don't get married. And Jesus says, no, for some, it might be better to not get married, but it's so that they're more free to serve. In other words, celibacy shouldn't be a selfish choice. It's just the opposite. It's for the good of others. It's not the preservation of our own comfort, Jesus says. But to be clear, again, Jesus says that's not the expectation for every Christian, but it might be for some. And so with that, even when we're talking about marriage and divorce, here we're reminded that singleness, whether that's someone who's never been married, or maybe that's someone on the other side of a divorce, or someone on the other side of losing a spouse, singleness is an opportunity for unique kingdom living, Jesus says. And while we, I think, rightly celebrate marriage in our church, that's not certainly to belittle those who are single, of course. You're not inferior or less useful for the kingdom. Your experience is unique. And Jesus says there's so much to embrace and to pursue as you follow Jesus in your singleness. But again, here's this confrontation between the Pharisees, Jesus, and Jesus reminds them, marriage was created by God. And it's an important, unique relationship within this world that he's created. Now, what we don't want to miss, though, is that marriage, even though it was designed for human flourishing and procreation and companionship, it was created for far more than that. Ultimately, marriage is meant to be a picture of the gospel. In fact, in Ephesians 5, Paul's letter there, he's instructing the Christians on how to relate in marriage and how a Christian marriage best functions according to God's design. And in that passage, he quotes Genesis 2:24, the same verse that Jesus brings up with the Pharisees there in Matthew 19. And this is what he says in Ephesians 5, verses 31 and 32. Again, he's quoting, he says, therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. But then he goes on. Notice what he says. This mystery is profound. And I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. Notice what Paul is saying. That word mystery in the New Testament is really important. That word mystery describes a truth that's always been there, but it's been hidden until the coming of Jesus. That now in his life, death, and resurrection, and all that he's accomplished us for salvation, now we understand this hidden truth a little bit better. And Paul says that's true for marriage as well. He's saying, yes, marriage is for companionship. Yes, it's for procreation, but it's for more. It's a picture of Jesus and his love for the church. The church, the people of God, are often referred to as Christ's bride, the bride of Christ. And Jesus then is often referred to in the Bible as the bridegroom, the groom of the bride. And so that's why when we read the New Testament, we hear parables about the groom coming to take his bride. Or we hear the language later in the book of Revelation that talk about this great wedding feast when the groom comes to bring us to himself for all eternity at his second coming. And so I just want you to think about that for a second, because we shouldn't miss it, that if you consider Genesis 1, the beginning of the Bible, and Revelation 21 and 22, the end of the Bible, marriage really does serve as the wraparound concept of the whole Bible, of the whole story. In fact, Ray Ortlund, who we've had here preach, he has a great little book on this, and I love what he says about this. This is what he says. He wrote, "The first cosmos was created as the home of a young couple named Adam and Eve. The new cosmos will be created as the eternal home of the Son and his bride." He goes on to say, and if the Bible is telling a story of married romance, no wonder that the demonic powers would forbid marriage. This is what he says. Every happy marriage whispers their doom and proclaims Christ's triumph. It's a beautiful vision for marriage, isn't it? That again, if marriage is a picture of the gospel, the love that Jesus has for his people, his bride, then Christian marriage really is kind of an act of rebellion against the darkness. Not perfect marriages, of course, but gospel-saturated marriages. Marriages where love is promised. Marriages where wrongs are forgiven, where sacrifice replaces selfishness, where grace abounds even though sin might abound as well. Marriages that are committed to displaying the gospel, exalt Christ while rebelling against the darkness of our culture and the enemy of Jesus and his bride. And so for those that are married this morning, let's commit ourselves to the Lord's calling and design once again. Can we do that? Let's commit ourselves to our spouses once again. Let's ask the Lord to help us cultivate marriages that do just that proclaim the gospel to our spouses and our children and our family and our friends and our community in the way that we relate to one another. For those this morning who are not married, commit your singleness to the Lord. For as long as the Lord would have you be single, commit to serve him and others with the time and resources that you have in this unique season of your life. And pray for the married people in your life, that we might continue to be strong and growing in our relationships with one another. But for all of us, whether married or single or divorced this morning, we all know we fail to live up to the high calling of the Lord. We sin against the Lord and against one another. We don't show the grace toward one another as we've been shown in the gospel. We've written off relationships far too quickly because we weren't willing to absorb the cost through forgiveness, as we've talked about. We've fallen short in so many ways. But hear the good news in the message of married romance in the Bible, that even though we've sinned, we've committed spiritual adultery, as it were. Notice, Jesus will never write a certificate of divorce for his bride. We can walk in assurance that Jesus will never cast us aside, not as a corporate people and not us individually, if you're a part of his people. That even though sin might abound, his grace abounds all the more. And as that faithful groom who loves relentlessly, he will bring his bride to live with him for all eternity. And so this morning, we're going to celebrate communion together. Again, for those who have turned from their sin and put their trust in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus for their salvation, you have entered into the new covenant, the Bible says, with Jesus. And on the night of his arrest in the upper room, Jesus actually said that covenant was accomplished through his blood. That's how seriously he's taken his vows, so to speak, to his bride. And so this morning, we eat the bread and we drink the cup, remembering that our groom, Jesus, laid down his life for us. And he's entered into a covenant with us. And from that covenant, he will never cast us aside, any of us who have come to him in faith. And so this morning, we want to invite you, if you've trusted in Jesus, if you've turned away from your sin, you've turned away from your self-righteousness, put all of your hope by faith in the finished work of Jesus for your salvation, we invite you to partake the elements anytime during our last two songs.